This episode is part antebellum true crime story, part tale of mob justice, and part illustration of an ancient honor culture at work in Natchez, Mississippi. It comes from an eyewitness account by a riverboat gambler named Thimblerig, who joined the legendary Davy Crockett on a steamboat bound for New Orleans not long after the incident occurred in 1835. Crockett was on his way to Texas and relayed Thimblerig's tale, which has been corroborated by court records, newspaper accounts, and other memoirs in his autobiography. I witnessed a sight during my stay there that almost froze my blood with horror and will serve as a specimen of the customs of the far South. A planter of the name of Foster, connected with the best families of the state, unprovoked in cold blood, murdered his young and beautiful wife a few months after marriage. He beat her deliberately to death in a walk adjoining his dwelling, carried the body to the hut of one of his slaves, washed the dirt from her person, and, assisted by his Negroes, buried her upon his plantation. Suspicion was awakened, the body disinterred, and the villain's guilt established. He fled, was overtaken, and secured in prison. His trial was, by some device of the law, delayed until the third term of the court. At length it came on, and so clear and indisputable was the evidence that not a doubt was entertained of the result, when, by an oversight on the part of the sheriff, who neglected swearing into office his deputy who summoned the jurors, the trial was abruptly discontinued, and all proceedings against Foster were suspended, or rather ended. There exist throughout the extreme South bodies of men who style themselves lynchers. When an individual escapes punishment by some technicality of the law, or perpetrates an offense not recognized in courts of justice, they seize him and inflict such chastisement as they conceive adequate to the offense. They usually act at night and disguise their persons. This society at Natchez embraces all the lawyers, physicians, and principal merchants of the place. Foster, whom all good men loathed as a monster unfit to live, was called into court and formally dismissed. But the lynchers were at hand. The moment he stepped from the courthouse, he was knocked down, his arms bound behind him, his eyes bandaged, and in this condition was marched to the rear of the town, where a deep ravine afforded a fit place for his punishment. His clothes were torn from his back, his head partially scalped. They next bound him to a tree. Each lyncher was supplied with a cowskin, and they took turns at the flogging until the flesh hung in ribbons from his body. A quantity of heated tar was then poured over his head and made to cover every part of his person. They finally showered a sack of feathers on him, and in this horrid guise, with no other apparel than a miserable pair of breeches, with a drummer at his heels, he was paraded through the principal streets at midday. No disguise was assumed by the lynchers. Owing to long confinement, his gait had become cramped and his movements were very faltering. By the time the procession reached the most public part of the town, Foster fell down from exhaustion and was allowed to lie there for a time without exciting the sympathies of anyone, an object of universal detestation. The blood oozing from his stripes had become mixed with the feathers and tar and rendered his aspect still more horrible and loathsome. Finding him unable to proceed further, a common dray was brought, and with his back to the horse's tail, the drummer standing over him playing the Rogue's March, he was reconducted to prison, the only place at which he would be received. A guard was placed outside of the jail to give notice to the body of lynchers when Foster might attempt to escape, for they had determined on branding him on the forehead and cutting his ears off. At 2 o'clock in the morning of the second subsequent day, 2 horsemen with a led horse stopped at the prison, and Foster was with difficulty placed astride. The lynchers wished to secure him. He put spurs to his beast and passed them. As he rode by, they fired at him. A ball struck his hat, which was thrown to the ground, and he escaped, but if ever found within the limits of the state, will be shot down as if a price was set on his head. Sights of this kind are by no means unfrequent. I once saw a gambler, a sort of friend of mine, by the way, detected cheating at faro at a time when the bets were running pretty high. They flogged him almost to death, added the tar and feathers, and placed him aboard a dugout, a sort of canoe, at 12 at night, and with no other instruments of navigation than a bottle of whiskey and a paddle, set him adrift in the Mississippi. He has never been heard of since, and the presumption is that he either died of his wounds or was run down in the night by a steamer. And this is what we call lynching in Natchez. Historian Bertram Wyatt Brown included the lynching of James Foster Jr. in his study of Southern honor. The mob had sought to purge the community of a deviant judged so beneath the human attribute that tar, a kind of representational excrement, was fitting apparel. In a patriarchal world, one might chastise a loved one, but few crimes were worse than intrafamilial killings. In addition, Foster was a gamester, in debt, accused of fraud, and so addicted to gambling that his habits aroused contempt even in that gambling-obsessed age and region. Like an alcoholic who could not hold his liquor, Foster repelled other men who were drinkers and gamblers themselves. His excesses caricatured their own inclinations in frightening ways. He was the mirror of what they might become. Wyatt Brown explained that chivalries, a type of ritualized mob action, were by no means unique to the antebellum South. They had been common throughout the original 13 colonies in the 18th century and across cultures and times. The chivalry included a range of crowd activity, from wedding day jest to public whipping and tar and feathering. It was a means of community policing stretching back to Neolithic Europe. Examples can be drawn from Portugal to the Balkans, the Levant to the Hebrides, from Plutarch's Moralia in the 1st century AD and the Old Testament book of Leviticus to 20th century news reports from Belfast and Londonderry. For hundreds of years, ecclesiastical precept and attempts to impose outsiders' law on community life failed to halt such proceedings in either the Old World or the New. Only as society became more secular in character, more impersonal in its dealings, and more institutional in its forms of exchange and control did the ancient ideal of community justice erode. In the American South, that transformation was somewhat slower than in the rest of the country. There, where a form of primal honor continued to flourish, one could find the same attitudes about aliens, deviants, and social underlings as once existed in very ancient times. What do you think of Thimblerig's story and of Wyatt Brown's analysis? Let me know in the comments. And help this little channel keep growing by subscribing if you haven't already, hitting that like button, and watching another one or two of my videos if you have time. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode.